Did you know that tree attack can burn a fire Pokémon, or that hidden power can never be normal or fairy? When Gen 2 came out, Game Freak introduced many elements that are still present in today's Pokémon games, such as new types, new Pokéballs, breeding, held items and much more. In this Iceberg, we'll take a look at the secrets and little known facts about the mechanics of Generation 2. Welcome to the Gen 2 Pokémon Mechanics Iceberg.
Say my name, EisenBerg. You're goddamn right.
Fly vulnerabilities. If you thought that flying was safe for your Pokémon like in Gen 1, well, think again, because although Swift no longer hits Pokémon in the sky, there are a couple of moves that will affect your Pokémon. Twister and Gust can hit a Pokémon in the sky, and they will inflict double the damage if it does. Whirlwind will also be able to affect a Pokémon in the sky, and Thunder will actually bypass accuracy checks during this turn, but only if it's raining. Another pair of moves that will make almost all attacks strike a Pokémon in the sky is Lock On and Mind Reader. The only attacks that won't strike are Earthquake, Magnitude and Fissure. Nonetheless, this changed in Generation 3. Speed Tie. This is an entry I wish I had covered in my previous Iceberg because it also happens in Gen 1. I actually thought that when two Pokémon have the same speed, the game would choose one at random, and from that point on, the attack order would alternate between them. Nonetheless, the order would be chosen randomly each consecutive turn. Earthquake and Fissure hit underground Pokémon. As I said in my Gen 1 Pokémon Mechanics Iceberg, certain situations in battle started making more sense given that moves such as Earthquake, Magnitude and Fissure will hit Pokémon underground. In fact, the first two will deal double the damage, and Fissure, although it doesn't bypass accuracy checks, still has a chance to hit. Special Defense. Special Defense made a huge difference when it comes to balancing the game. As you may know, what we now know as Special Attack and Special Defense were packed into a single stat called Special. This means that if a Mewtwo has a Special of 406, from a modern perspective, that means that it also has a Special Defense of 406. This made this genetic monster both a Special Sweeper and a Special Wall at the same time. However, Game Freak made the right choice by splitting Special into these two stats, so that Pokémon with a high special attack didn't necessarily have a high special defense. Type effectiveness changes. Besides the addition of Dark and Steel, a lot of things changed in Gen 2 for the best. Ghost types were finally super effective against Psychic Pokémon, and a more or less decent move was added in the form of Shadow Ball. And I say decent because back then, Ghost was physical. Poison and Bug were no longer super effective against each other, and Ice was no longer neutrally effective against Fire. Friendship. This is quite interesting because many people think that Friendship was introduced in Generation 2, especially because some Pokémon evolved through it in Gold, Silver and Crystal, but in reality it was introduced in Pokémon Yellow, although only for Pikachu. If you want to increase a Pokémon's friendship, you can level it up, use a vitamin, learn a TM, or walk 512 steps. You want a Pokémon's friendship to increase if you want to evolve some Pokémon such as Eevee, Chansey, Golbat or Pichu. Also, the base power of the move Return takes friendship into account. If your Pokémon has maximum friendship, its base power is 102. If it's at the minimum, the base power becomes 0. Frustration, on the other hand, does the opposite. The less attached the Pokémon is to its trainer, the higher its base power is. Roaming Pokémon. Roaming Pokémon are annoying. First, you need to meet the conditions to be able to find them in the wild in the first place. Then you need to get lucky to come across them. You need to pray that the Pokémon stays inside the Pokéball you threw at it. And no, fast balls are normal Pokéballs in disguise unless you throw them at Magnemite, Grimer or Tangela. But we'll talk about that later. Once you find Raikou, Entei or Suicune, you'll be able to see their current location on the map. But the problem is that even if you know where they are, are, they'll be in a different location once you move there. Something I didn't know is that when you enter a battle, there's a 1 in 16 chance that a roaming Pokémon moves to a different part of the map without you moving. Also, when you step in tall grass that is currently in the same area as a roaming Pokémon, the player has a 25 in 256 chance, or about a 10% of encountering it when you enter a wild battle. If you encounter the same roaming Pokémon again, it will retain the DVs it got during the first encounter. This means that, since shininess is determined by these numbers, if you happen to find a shiny roaming Pokémon, it will always be shiny if you find it again. Although any damage you inflict to this Pokémon remains in subsequent encounters, any status condition inflicted resets each time they flee. If you don't want the Pokémon to flee, trapping moves such as Mean Look or Wrap can do the trick. Also, Sleep and Freeze prevent roaming Pokémon from fleeing, so keep that in mind if you want to catch the legendary beasts in Gen 2. Being frozen or asleep were no longer death sentences. Frozen Pokémon in Gen 1 were endless punching bags because unless you used the fire move that can burn a Pokémon, they would remain frozen until they are defeated. This changed in Gen 2 because a frozen Pokémon has an almost 10% chance of thawing out. Something I didn't know is that if Sunny Day is in effect, you can't freeze an opponent. This is the case for future generations. Although not as severe, a sleeping Pokémon could remain in this state for up to 7 turns, and in Red, Blue and Yellow, it had no option to attack on the turn it woke up. In Generation 2, this status condition can last between 2 and 8 turns, with the exception of the Battle Tower and Pokémon Stadium 2, where sleep only lasts 2 to 4 turns. In addition, a Pokémon that wakes up can immediately attack, meaning that it's no longer exposed to falling asleep again before it has a chance to use its turn. Also, moves such as Snore and Sleep Talk could be used under this status condition. Gender system and Pokémon X. We saw a glimpse of this with the introduction of the Nidoran male and Nidoran female lines, but other than the male and female symbol, these Pokémon were like any other in Generation 1. Starting in Generation 2, Pokémon could be of a different gender, with the exception of creatures such as Magnemite, Porygon, Ditto, and legendary Pokémon at that time, besides having a certain impact on battles, such as when Attract is used against a Pokémon of the opposite gender to prevent it from moving. This mechanics was implemented to obtain Pokémon X. These newborn Pokémon could inherit moves that would be impossible to get through other means. For example, if you have a male Dragonite that knows Outrage and a female Charizard, your Charmander would be able to learn this powerful dragon move. I wanted to mention the fact that Pokémon X have a 1 in 64 chance of being shiny when hatching, and although this sounds wonderful, the sad reality is that, considering how painfully slow it was to hatch Pokémon even while riding your bicycle, I think we're better off hunting shiny Pokémon in Scarlet and Violet with all the sandwiches, shiny charms and Masuda methods we got in later generations. Day and Night Cycle. The Kanto games, as a product of the 90s, had a lot to improve on. Playing Red, Blue and Yellow forced you to play in an eternal daylight, an element I didn't touch on, but I think contributed to its liminal feeling. Thankfully, Gold and Silver implemented a day and night cycle, something that made you feel that you were in a more lively world and that for some mysterious reason didn't return in Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald or any of the main series games in Generation 3. Not only was it a graphical element that distinguished between day and night, but also a key factor in obtaining Umbreon and Espeon, as well as the kind of Pokémon we would be able to encounter. In fact, the days of the week were also important, as certain events would only happen on specific days, such as Fridays, when Lapras can be encountered in Union Cave. Moves that changed type. There are 4 moves from Gen 1 that changed their type in upcoming generations. Sand Attack was a normal move that became a ground type attack. This, however, didn't stop it from affecting flying type Pokémon. I don't recall this, but Gust was a normal type move until it became a flying type in Gen 2. Karate Chop, a move that immediately reminds us of fighting, was also a normal type attack until in Gold, Silver and Crystal became a fighting move. Finally, Bite, that was yet another normal type move, became a dark type attack. Critical hits don't depend on speed. We know that critical hits were tied to the Pokémon's speed. Fast Pokémon such as Electrode would land critical hits 1/4 of the times due to this feature, but in Gen 2 all Pokémon, whether slow or fast, have around a chance of 17 in 256 of landing a critical hit, or about 6.64%. From Gen 3 onward, the probability of landing critical hits would decrease as generations went by. Weather conditions. Not only did Gen 2 give us day and night, but also weather conditions in the form of harsh sunlight, rain and sandstorm, at least in Pokémon battles. Sunny day boosts fire-type moves by 50%, but also decreases the power of water attacks by the same amount. If a Pokémon uses Solar Beam when harsh sunlight is in effect, it doesn't need to charge an extra turn, and instead attacks in the same turn the move is selected. Synthesis and Morning Sun also benefit from this. If the Pokémon heals during this weather, it'll recover half of its maximum HP. If Thunder is not the most accurate move, under this weather effect it lowers its accuracy to only 50%. Also, you can't freeze Pokémon under sunny weather, but only in Generation 2. Under rain, water moves are benefited with a 50% increase in power. As expected, the power of fire moves is decreased by 50%. As I mentioned before, Thunder bypasses accuracy checks when a Pokémon in the rain is in the semi-invulnerable turn of Fly. Solar Beam becomes a 60 base power attack if it charges under rain, and Synthesis, Morning Sun and Moonlight heal 1/8 of the user's maximum HP. Sandstorm damages Pokémon 1/16 of their maximum HP, with the exception of Rock, Steel and Ground Pokémon, and same as Rain, it makes the healing moves I talked about heal 1/8 of the user's maximum HP. Finite power points. Having trainers or wild Pokémon with infinite power points was good and bad at the same time. On one hand, you had situations that could lead you to an infinite, unwinnable battle, that in best case scenario would force you to restart it, but in the worst would softlock your game. On the other hand, difficult to catch Pokémon would never run out of PP, meaning that they would never knock out themselves, at least not with struggle. Bug type improvements. I don't think there was any good bug Pokémon in Gen 1, and even Gen 2 didn't do a lot to solve this issue completely. Just look at Ariados and Ladian. The first one is yet another part poison bug Pokémon, and I think Ladian is considered one of the worst fully evolved Pokémon, not only in this generation, but in future games as well. Scizor has a cool design, but it wasn't really that great unless you used a turn to boost its attack or speed with Sword Stance or Agility respectively. The only bug type move it could learn was Fury Cutter, an attack with a base power of 10 in the first turn. Also, the fact that the physical special split didn't happen until Gen 4 didn't help it too much. The only two bug Pokémon that were pretty good were Heracross and Fortress. Fortress has an excellent defense and an amazing bug steel combination, and Heracross has a good special defense to survive fire moves, and its signature move Megahorn has a base power of 120. Rollout after learning a new move. As many of you know, Rollout is a move that once selected, won't stop until it misses or hits the opponent 5 times. In a trainer battle, if Rollout knocks out an opponent that causes the user to level up and learn a new move, if the player deletes Rollout before the move misses or hits 5 times, Rollout will continue in spite of no longer being part of the user's moveset. Held items changed Pokémon forever. Held items are the equivalent of introducing abilities in Gen 3 because they completely changed the way we play Pokémon up to this day. Pokémon get a chance to cure a status condition, recover HP, move first in spite of their speed, resist a move that otherwise would have knocked them out, and many more things without the need to select an item in the middle of a battle. Also, we got some that made our life easier while traversing the Johto region, such as being able to earn double the money from a trainer battle, share experience with weak Pokémon, and increase their friendship, among others. Talking about items, there are at least 2 that I know of that never appeared again in future Pokémon games. One of them is an unremarkable item that only Machop can hold, but only if transferred from Gen 1 to Gold, Silver and Crystal. The item in question is a brick piece that some have theorized that has something to do with the old man in Vermilion City preparing a plot of land. The other item in question is the Berserk Gene. As I've said multiple times, it's like a self-inflicted swagger, increasing the attack of the Pokémon by 2 stages but confusing it, making it risky because if the Pokémon hits itself in confusion, the damage received will be higher. Hidden Power. Hidden Power is a unique move because it allows the vast majority of Pokémon to use a move of a type that otherwise would be impossible. I guess this isn't the case anymore, but back then, electric Pokémon had very limited move pools that mainly included electric and normal type attacks. If you didn't have a Pikachu or Raichu who knew Surf, you were defenseless against ground type Pokémon. However, Hidden Power gave electric Pokémon the chance to use a water or ice type attack, for example. In addition, Hidden Power can also vary in power, ranging between 31 and 70. This is all determined by the DVs of the Pokémon, but if you want to learn how to make your Pokémon have a certain hidden power, you can find hidden power calculators on the internet. It's worth noting that outside of Legends Arceus, hidden power can't be normal or fairy type. Question marks type. We know that the question marks type, introduced in Generation 2, belongs to the move Curse, but there are some interesting properties about it that aren't clear in the game. One of the aspects about the question marks type that not too many know is that if it's hacked into a damaging move, it will inflict physical damage. On top of that, it's neutrally effective against all types, and all types are neutrally effective against it. Curse is a very unique move because if it's used by a ghost Pokémon, it will cut in half its own HP to cast a curse on the opponent and deduct 1/16 of its HP. If used by any other type, it raises the user's attack and defense but lowers its speed. Pursuit. Pursuit would be a totally unremarkable dark move with its 4D base power, but the fact that it can hit a Pokémon that is about to be switched out can be a game changer. If the trainer attempts to switch out a Pokémon, no matter the speed of the Pursuit user, the Pokémon will be hit with double the damage before it goes back to its Pokéball. This move is very convenient when it's obvious that the opponent will switch out, for example when a Tyranitar is facing an Alakazam. Since Alakazam's base defense is quite low, Pursuit will result in a knockout most of the times. Cutting long grass. If you go to the national park in Gold, Silver and Crystal, you'll find tall grass. What's interesting about it is that if you use Cut, instead of removing it completely, it will become normal grass. If you use the move once more, the grass will be removed completely. Steel and Dark types exist to stop Psychic Pokémon. We know how broken Psychic Pokémon such as Starmie, Exeggutor and Alakazam were in Red, Blue and Yellow. These Pokémon were completely immune to Ghost, or more precisely, to the weak 20 base power Lick. A lot of bugs were slow and part poison, so they were out of the question when facing the likes of Mewtwo and Mew. However, Game Freak knew that they had to do something if they wanted to balance the game, and they finally put a stop to Psychic Pokémon with the introduction of the Dark and Steel types. Talking about the Steel type, I used to think that actually Psychic should be super effective against Steel Pokémon because, well, one of the most iconic ways that people with Psychic powers display their abilities is by bending spoons. In fact, we can see a lot of trainers in the Saffron City gym trying to do this in the anime. But, well, back to the topic. These two types were introduced to balance the game. Steel resists Psychic, and Dark is not only super effective against them, but also immune. Although no Pokémon from Gen 1 gained the Dark type, Magnemite and Magneton became part Steel from Gen 2 onward. Explosion has a base power of 500. We saw that Explosion had a base power of 170 in red, blue and yellow, but that because the move halves the opponent's defense, it made it a move with a base power of 340. Things got even crazier in Gen 2, because the move's power was increased to 250, and since this attack still halves the opponent's defense, it became a 500 base power move. Two-Needle against Steel Pokémon. The back then newly introduced Steel type resisted 11 types and it was immune to poison. As expected, Steel types were unaffected by moves such as Toxic and Poison Powder, but something I didn't know is that there is actually a way to poison a Steel type Pokémon. All you need is a Pokémon with Two-Needle, as due to an oversight, this attack has a 20% chance of inflicting poison on Steel Pokémon in the second turn. My theory is that because it's not a poison attack, even Steel Pokémon are susceptible to Two-Needle's secondary effect. Magnitude can have a base power of 3600. Magnitude is like a randomized earthquake in terms of power. This move can have a base power between 10 and 150, depending on the magnitude that ranges between 4 and 10. Normally magnitude 10 would have a base power of 150, same as that of a Hyper Beam. However, if the move lands a critical hit, its power becomes 300, but there's more. If the opponent is underground, magnitude will deal double the damage, resulting in a power of 600. Taking stab into account, multiply 600 by 1.5 and it becomes 900. If the opponent is weak to ground, then the number becomes 1800. But if the opponent's second type is also weak to ground, then the power of magnitude would be 3600. Now, you may think that there is no Pokemon with double weakness to ground that can learn Dig naturally, and you would be right, but there's a legit way for this to happen. If you have a Magnemite in Gen 1 with Mimic and transfer it to Gen 2, this Pokemon can mimic Dig from, let's say, Golem. Then, all you have to do is wait for the planets to align and hope your Golem gets lucky enough to land a critical hit magnitude 10 while Magnemite is underground. Max Power Rollout. If you thought that magnitude 10 under specific situations could inflict massive damage, let's analyze what Rollout can do. This move has a base power of 30 that doubles with each consecutive hit. Because it can hit up to 5 times, its power reaches 480. In addition, if the Pokemon uses Defense Curl, its power will be doubled, reaching a total of 960. What if we make it a critical hit? That would be a hit with a power of 1920. If the opponent is weak against rock, we need to double the result, but if it has a double weakness against rock like Charizard, we need to quadruple 1920, resulting in a power of 7680. There is more though. If the Rollout user is a rock type, we multiply that number 1.5 times and the final result, not even taking boosts into account, is 11520. Status conditions don't matter. There are two tiers when it comes to status conditions. In number 1, sleep and freeze. In number 2, burn, paralysis and poison. Sleep and freeze increase your chance of catching a Pokemon by 3.91%, while the other status conditions were intended to increase it by 1.95. However, due to an oversight, burning, poisoning or paralyzing a wild Pokemon has no effect whatsoever. No wonder, because I used to paralyze Pokemon to catch them more easily, and I didn't notice any difference. Gen 2 fixed a lot of issues in the competitive aspect, but made a lot of mistakes when it comes to catching Pokemon, as you'll see deeper in the Iceberg. Beat Up mechanics. Beat Up is a very strange move because it's the only attack that will hit the opponent up to 6 times, provided you have a full conscious team. Although it's a dark type move, it inflicts typeless damage, meaning that no matter what type is hit by it, it will receive neutral damage. Its base power is 10, but the damage it inflicts is determined by the base attack and level of each individual Pokemon in your party, as well as the target speed's defense, because it's considered a physical move. In my Gen 2 glitches Iceberg, I spoke about how this move can cause a desynchronization if playing against another human opponent, something that can lead to catastrophic effects that keep getting worse as the battle goes on. Shiny Pokémon in Pokémon Stadium 2. All Pokémon the player faces in Pokémon Stadium are preset. This means that the Pokémon you face in the gym leader's castle have the same DVs, names, genders, and attacks. But this is not the case in Pokémon Stadium 2, or at least not in the Challenge Cup, because same as in the main series games, there's a 1 in 8,192 chance of encountering a shiny Pokémon in said challenge. A prime example is that of speedrunner Werster, when he unexpectedly encountered a shiny Onix in this cup. Getting a held item stolen by a wild Pokémon. There's a slim chance in Gold, Silver, and Crystal to get a held item stolen by a wild Pokémon. First, your Pokémon would need to have the move Thief, a move that can steal the opponent's item if the user is not holding one. Then, you need to encounter a Ditto that transforms into your Pokémon to use Thief against you. Once your item is stolen, you'll lose that item forever. Tree Attack can thaw out frozen Pokémon. Tree Attack has several unique features that were only present in Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Although this move has a 20% chance to paralyze, burn, or freeze the opponent from Gen 2 onward, you could only burn fire Pokémon and freeze ice types in this generation. This is similar to how Twinneedle can poison steel Pokémon. As if it weren't enough, Tree Attack has a 1 in 3 chance of thawing out a frozen Pokémon. Differently colored Pokémon in Stadium 1 and 2. This was supposed to make it in the Gen 1 Pokémon mechanics Iceberg. Not to be confused with shiny Pokémon, differently colored Pokémon refer to normal Pokémon that, based on a formula that takes into account their nickname, original trainer's name, and trainer ID, will have a different color. For example, a Mewtwo called Genetic, whose trainer's name is red and has the trainer ID 01024, will look reddish, while a Mewtwo called Frieza, whose trainer's name is blue and has the trainer ID 54895, will be bluish. There's a website called Blue Moon Falls that has an amazing tool that allows you to preview each and every single Pokémon in the Stadium series and all their possible colors in these games. Zap Cannon doesn't always paralyze. I was always under the impression that Zap Cannon had a 100% chance of paralyzing a Pokémon when it hits, something that is actually true from Generation 3 onward. However, in Gen 2, this electric type attack has a 1 in 256 chance of hitting the opponent without paralyzing it. New Pokéballs don't work. We've explored how the original Pokéballs in Gen 1 work in my previous Iceberg, and by Gen 2, you may think that finally, Game Freak had learned how to make Pokéballs, especially because it introduced a new group of these items, but it's precisely this that got a lot of issues. The Love Ball, a Pokéball that was intended to have a ×8 catch rate modifier against Pokémon of the opposite gender, well, it only works if the other Pokémon is of the exact same species and gender, otherwise you'll have a Pokéball in disguise. The mythical fastball that many of us used to catch Suicune and the other roaming Pokémon before they escaped only works on Pokémon that have a 10% chance of fleeing, meaning Magnemite, Grimer, and Tangela. The level ball works as intended and not at the same time. Although it works better the higher your Pokémon's level is, it doesn't take into account current HP or status condition. This means that it's completely useless to lower the Pokémon's HP or inflict a status condition if you're only planning to use level balls. The Moon Ball is a complete failure because it has a ×4 catch rate modifier on Pokémon that evolve with a burn heal, and considering all the Pokémon that evolve through that method, you can imagine how effective it is. The Lure Ball has a 3× catch rate modifier when used on Pokémon found during fishing encounters. The Friend Ball is another new Pokéball that has the same effectiveness as a regular Pokéball, but that sets the recently caught Pokémon's friendship to 200. Finally, the heavy ball works better on heavier Pokémon, as its name implies, in Gold and Silver. Nonetheless, there's an oversight in Pokémon Crystal that I talked about in my Gen 2 glitches Iceberg that makes Kadabra, Tauros and Sunflora extremely heavy Pokémon. As you can see, only 2 out of the 7 Pokéballs introduced in Gen 2 worked as intended in the 3 main series games. Thank you so much for watching. I've recently remade my Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask Iceberg and combined it into a 50-minute long video in the EisenBerg experience. I'll be uploading a lot of content there, so make sure to follow me. If you also want to become a YouTuber, join the members of the channel and discover the content that will help you understand the world of YouTube. See you in the next one.